Mandalay Bay is not empty by accident. It is the result of a structural shift that has been building for nearly 2 decades. A flagship resort on the Las Vegas Strip is losing its energy, its identity, and its core audience at the same time. Why is this happening? What is being quietly restructured behind the scenes? Who is really benefiting from a model that looks stable on paper but feels hollow in reality? Because this is not just about lower foot traffic. It is about a system that is prioritizing predictable revenue over long-term sustainability, and the consequences are already visible. Stay with me, because the real story is not what you see, it is what has been removed. If you value deep, data-driven investigations like this, consider liking the video, subscribing, and turning on notifications. Mandalay Bay officially opened on March 2, 1999, developed by Circus Enterprises with a total investment of approximately $950 million. At the time, it was positioned as a large-scale integrated resort at the southern end of the Las Vegas Strip, designed to function as a self-contained destination rather than a stop within a broader itinerary. The original vision was clear: keep guests on property, extend length of stay, increase per visitor spending through a fully integrated experience. The resort delivered an 11-acre beach complex, a wave pool, a convention center, entertainment venues, and a diversified restaurant portfolio. This was not excess, it was strategy. By the early 2000s, Mandalay Bay had established itself as a stable performer. It was not competing directly with ultra-luxury properties like Bellagio, but it occupied a strong middle to upper segment with high perceived value. Room sizes were above Strip averages. Pricing remained accessible relative to experience. The customer base reflected that positioning: repeat visitors, middle-income travelers, long-stay guests. That alignment between product, price, and expectation created consistency. Today, that alignment no longer holds. The infrastructure remains, the branding remains, but the operating model has changed. What was once a destination built around leisure demand is now something else entirely, and that shift did not happen organically. It was engineered. The structural shift begins with ownership. In April 2005, Mandalay Resort Group was acquired by MGM Mirage in a transaction valued at approximately $7.9 billion. Mandalay Bay was no longer an independent operating asset. It became part of a consolidated portfolio competing for capital allocation and strategic positioning. The more significant change came later. In 2020, MGM Resorts executed a sale-leaseback transaction for Mandalay Bay. The underlying real estate was sold to Vici Properties and Blackstone Real Estate Income Trust for approximately $4.6 billion. MGM retained operational control but entered into a long-term triple net lease. Under this structure, MGM is responsible for property taxes, insurance, and maintenance, while also paying fixed base rent with contractual escalators tied to inflation and performance thresholds. This is where the pressure builds. Rent is not optional. It is a fixed obligation. It increases over time. It is prioritized ahead of discretionary spending. At the same time, carries broader corporate debt obligations across its portfolio, with refinancing cycles and interest rate exposure shaping capital allocation decisions. The result is a layered financial structure. Real estate owners require stable rent, operators require margin, debt markets require consistency, and Mandalay Bay sits in the middle of that system, not as a destination, but as a revenue-generating asset designed to service multiple financial layers simultaneously. This is the mechanism that defines its current trajectory. To understand the current condition of Mandalay Bay, you have to look at how the numbers behave inside this structure. MGM Resorts International does not report Mandalay Bay as a standalone asset, but within its Las Vegas Strip Resort segment. In 2023, this segment generated approximately $8.8 billion in net revenue, with adjusted EBITDA around $3.1 billion. That represented a modest increase of roughly 5 to 7% year over year, driven largely by pricing power rather than volume growth. Visitor data tells a more complex story. According to Las Vegas Convention and Visitors Authority, total Las Vegas visitation reached about 40.8 million in 2023, still below the pre-pandemic peak of 42.5 million in 2019. Convention attendance rebounded sharply, but leisure visitation remained uneven, particularly midweek. This matters because Mandalay Bay is now heavily exposed to convention cycles. During major events, occupancy spikes and average daily rates increase significantly. But outside those windows, utilization drops. Gaming revenue per visitor is also under pressure across the Strip, as higher room rates and fees reduce discretionary spending. So while top-line revenue appears stable, the composition of that revenue is shifting. More predictable, more concentrated, but also more dependent on pricing rather than organic demand growth. And that creates a fragile balance, one that holds until it doesn't. This is where the pressure becomes visible. Under the triple net lease with Vici Properties and Blackstone Real Estate Income Trust, Mandalay Bay carries fixed rent obligations that must be paid regardless of occupancy levels. These payments include built-in escalators, meaning the cost base increases over time, even if demand does not. That is the first constraint. The second is debt servicing at the corporate level. MGM Resorts International has managed multi-billion-dollar debt across its portfolio, with interest expense sensitive to refinancing cycles and broader rate environments. Capital must be allocated carefully, and properties like Mandalay Bay are expected to produce stable cash flow to support that system. Then comes operating leverage. A large-scale resort carries high fixed costs: staffing, utilities, maintenance, and ongoing capital expenditure to prevent visible deterioration. Depreciation continues regardless of occupancy. CapEx cannot be deferred indefinitely without impacting guest experience. Now combine these layers: rising rent, persistent debt obligations, high fixed operating costs, and revenue that fluctuates based on convention cycles. This creates margin compression. To offset it, pricing increases, resort fees, parking charges, higher average daily rates. But those adjustments introduce a secondary problem. They weaken perceived value. And once perceived value declines, demand does not collapse immediately. It erodes quietly, consistently. That erosion is already happening, not as a forecast, as a present condition. Mandalay Bay is not operating in isolation. It is part of a strip that is changing its center of gravity. According to Las Vegas Convention and Visitors Authority, convention attendance recovered strongly in 2023 and 2024, but leisure visitation remains uneven across different segments. Midweek occupancy is increasingly dependent on corporate events, while weekend demand is concentrated in Central Strip properties. Airport data reinforces this shift. Harry Reid International Airport handled over 57 million passengers in 2023, approaching pre-pandemic levels. But higher airfare and inflation have altered spending behavior once visitors arrive. At the same time, the competitive landscape is evolving. Online gambling continues to expand across multiple U.S. states, reducing the necessity of traveling to Las Vegas purely for gaming. New attractions like the Sphere and high-end developments in the Central Strip are pulling foot traffic north. There is also a widening gap between strip resorts and local casinos. Local properties compete on value and convenience. Strip properties compete on experience and pricing power. Mandalay Bay sits in between, too distant to benefit from Central Strip foot traffic. Too expensive to compete with locals. Too dependent on conventions to stabilize demand. This is not a collapse. It is a repositioning within a market that is becoming more segmented, more competitive, and less forgiving. On the surface, the system still works. Revenue remains stable. Convention bookings continue. Occupancy spikes during peak periods. But inside the structure, something does not align. Because while revenue is holding, engagement is declining. The property is filling rooms with guests who do not behave like traditional Las Vegas visitors. They attend conferences. They follow schedules. They spend less time on the casino floor. So you get a paradox: higher pricing, but lower perceived value, stable occupancy, but weaker on-site spending, a full building. That feels empty. And that is the risk. Because Las Vegas was not built on occupancy alone. It was built on discretionary behavior. When that behavior changes, the revenue model becomes dependent on fewer variables, more predictable, but less resilient, and over time, that makes the system more fragile than it appears. So the question is not whether Mandalay Bay can remain open. It can. The question is whether this structure can remain sustainable over the long term. A property originally designed around leisure demand, now operating under a convention-driven model, carrying fixed rent obligations, facing rising costs, and competing in a market that is shifting away from its location. That is not a temporary imbalance. It is a structural test. Because every variable in this system is tightening at the same time. Pricing cannot increase indefinitely without affecting demand. Cost structures cannot remain elevated without compressing margins. And repositioning cannot continue without altering brand identity. So what happens next? Does MGM Resorts International recalibrate toward leisure demand, realign value perception, and restore engagement? Or does Mandalay Bay continue along its current path, gradually transitioning from a destination into a supporting asset within a larger financial system? There is no immediate answer, no announcement, no definitive turning point, but the pressure is already there. And in Las Vegas, pressure does not disappear, it compounds. If you found this analysis valuable, consider liking the video, subscribing, and turning on notifications. And if you want to understand how other strip properties are facing similar structural pressure, watch the next video on your screen.